Trees and silence are two things that have long been associated with this place. Every October, a small team walks into the forest at the base of Mount Fuji and starts counting. They're not counting trees. They're counting what's left behind: shoes, backpacks, tents that were pitched and never taken down. For decades, Japanese authorities published that number every year. In 2003 alone, it hit 105 bodies recovered in 12 months. Eventually, officials stopped releasing the figures at all because they were worried the number itself was pulling people in. Today, we're covering one of Japan's most infamous paranormal and tragic locations. This is the untold story of Aokigahara, also known as Japan's suicide forest. On October 3rd, 2024, a 34-year-old former Army Ranger named Ethan Carter walked past the last tourist sign and off the marked trail. 72 hours later, a rescue helicopter found him on a gravel clearing, dehydrated, his camera shattered, mumbling about a woman who, according to every search record from that operation, was never there. This is what happened to him. But before we get to that, we need to talk about the forest itself, because Aokigahara doesn't need ghost stories to be terrifying. The real history does most of the work on its own. Aokigahara sits on the northwestern base of Mount Fuji, 35 square kilometers of forest, growing straight out of hardened lava from an eruption in 864 CE. The ground hikers walk on is over 1,000 years old, and it has never fully cooled. Locals call it Jukai, the sea of trees. From above, the canopy moves like water, dense and unbroken for miles. From inside, the silence is total. The lava rock is porous. It absorbs sound the way a sponge pulls in water. People who've walked it say their own footsteps start to sound wrong. Their own breathing sounds too loud. Some say a scream barely carries past the first few trees. The roots can't grow down into solid rock, so they grow sideways instead, crawling across the surface in tangled, overlapping knots. Underneath all of it, lava tubes, sudden drops, hidden caves, some deep enough to disappear into entirely. Every direction looks the same. Same trees, same moss, same roots. No horizon, no landmark, nothing to fix your position by. And the compasses don't behave either. The rock is loaded with magnetic iron, and a needle placed against it will drift, slow and aimless, refusing to settle on north. People have been finding this out the hard way for decades. Long before Suicide Forest became a name people typed into search engines, this region already had a relationship with death. Local folklore speaks of ubasute, famine years when families carried an elderly or sick relative deep into the forest and left them there. The story has lived in this region for centuries. In 1960, the novel Tower of Waves depicted a heartbroken woman entering Aokigahara to die. It became a bestseller, and suicides in the forest rose sharply afterward. In 1993, a second book did more damage. A practical guide that described Aokigahara as remote, dense, and quiet enough for someone to disappear for a long time before being found. Search and recovery teams have entered Aokigahara every year since 1970. One veteran guide later recalled finding 36 bodies in 37 days. For him, it wasn't a story. It was work, and tied around the trunks at irregular intervals through the outer trails. Thin strips of plastic ribbon, left by people who weren't fully certain. A way back to the path if they change their mind partway in. Some of that tape leads back out. A lot of it just stops. People say they've experienced yurei, restless spirits in Japanese tradition of the dead who never found peace. Tengu, the bird spirit, is said to lead travelers off the path and never let them find it again. The forest has carried both stories for generations. Stranger still is how often the reports match. Hikers and volunteers, decades apart and unknown to one another, describing the same things. A sense of direction that suddenly fails, even on familiar trails. The feeling of being watched from the tree line only to find nothing there. A voice calling from one direction, then another, before falling silent the moment someone answers. Day 1. Carter wasn't a tourist. He was an outdoor filmmaker out of Colorado with a channel built on solo wilderness footage, a former Army Ranger who'd shot content in grizzly country and around active volcanic vents in Iceland. He planned just one night in Aokigahara, enough to get footage past the tourist trail and back out before dark the next day. He stepped off the marked path just after noon, camera running, narrating the geology as he went, the sideways growing roots, the broken lava ground underfoot. About an hour and a half in, he noticed the sound had changed. Not gone exactly, just compressed, like the forest had its own ceiling pressed close overhead. He kept walking. 20 minutes after that, he found tape. A single strip, red, tied around a low branch, and then nothing. No path continuing from it, no clearing, no sign of where the person who left it had actually gone. Carter knew exactly what that kind of tape usually meant, and he kept the camera on it a beat too long before moving on. When he checked his GPS not long after, it was dead. No signal, spinning. His compass needle drifted slowly side to side instead of settling. None of this was unexplainable. It's the documented iron content in the rock doing exactly what it's known to do. But knowledge and instinct are different things, and Carter's instinct told him to turn back toward where he thought the trail was. 40 minutes into walking back, he found a pair of black running shoes sitting upright at the base of a tree, laces still tied, facing deeper into the woods. No bag near them, no jacket. He recognized the tree. He'd passed it less than an hour earlier, walking the opposite direction. He picked a new line and kept moving, faster now, no longer filming. 30 minutes after that, the same shoes were sitting directly in front of his boots. He'd walked in a full circle without realizing it, which is, unfortunately, one of the most common and well-documented things that happens to people lost in dense, repetitive terrain with no horizon line. It has a name. It's called circling, and it's a known hazard in any environment without clear landmarks. Knowing the explanation didn't make it less frightening to experience. By the time the light started failing, Carter accepted he wasn't getting back to the main trail before dark. He pitched his bivvy tent near the tree with the shoes, partly because it was the one fixed point he recognized, partly because he didn't want to walk further without daylight. He got inside and waited out the night. Day 2. He didn't sleep much. Just before 2 in the morning, he heard something outside, a slow, even sound on the ground, circling the tent at a steady pace. Not the chaotic rustle of an animal moving through brush, something deliberate. He grabbed his knife, waited for it to pass the far side of the tent, then went out fast with his flashlight up. There was nothing there, but there were prints in the moss, bare feet pressed clearly into the damp ground. The prints circled the tent and disappeared into bare rock. He sat up with the knife until morning. By afternoon, things had gotten harder. The GPS was still dead, the compass still useless. and Carter had been walking for hours through terrain that refused to look any different from where he'd started. Dehydrated, he found a lava tube, one of the dozens of caves the forest is known for, and lowered himself in, hoping for condensation or runoff water. At the back of the cave, his light caught a scattering of left-behind items: a faded toy, an old lantern, a water bottle with a Tokyo convenience store label, half empty. The kind of things search teams find every year in this forest and quietly catalog before moving on. Carter knew enough about the place to understand what he was looking at. That's when he heard it. A voice. Faint, coming from somewhere above the cave mouth, filtered down through the rock. At first he thought it was the wind moving through the lava tube, the way air sometimes does in tight spaces, bending into something that almost sounds human. He stayed still and listened. It wasn't wind. It was a woman's voice, and it was speaking Japanese in a tone that was almost conversational. Not screaming, not panicked. Calm, even. The way someone calls out a name when they already expect an answer. It rose, paused, and rose again, like she was checking room after room of a house that wasn't there. Carter's first instinct was relief. Another person, finally, someone who could tell him which way was out. Then the thought caught up with him. It was the middle of the afternoon, deep off trail, in a forest where official patrols only worked the main paths. Nobody came out this far to call a name like that. Not casually. Not without a reason he didn't want to think about too hard. He climbed out of the cave slowly, water bottle still in hand, and stood at the mouth of it listening. The voice was still going somewhere ahead of him in the trees, maybe 30 yards out, maybe more. Distance was impossible to judge in a forest that swallowed sound the way this one did. He took a few steps toward it, then a few more. "Hello?" he called out in English, his voice cracking from thirst. The voice stopped instantly, mid-syllable, like someone had cut a recording. Carter stood frozen, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, no footsteps retreating, no rustle of someone startled and backing away. Just the dead, pressurized silence the forest kept falling back into whenever anything happened in it. He waited there for what felt like a full minute, water bottle forgotten in his hand, half expecting the voice to start again from somewhere closer. Then, off to his right, something shifted in a stand of low bushes, a single short rustle, gone before he could turn his flashlight on it. That was enough. Carter backed toward the cave mouth without taking his eyes off the bushes, climbed back down into the lava tube, and sat there in the dark for a long time before he convinced himself to go back out and keep moving. By the third night, sleep-deprived and badly dehydrated, Carter was sitting with his back against a tree when he noticed lights moving through the trees at a distance, small, amber, swaying the way a carried lantern sways. He followed them for close to an hour. They never got closer and never disappeared, holding a constant distance no matter how fast or slow he moved, leading him over ground he couldn't see clearly in the dark. The lights stopped. Carter stopped too, breathing hard, flashlight aimed at the spot where they'd been. It was somewhere past 3 in the morning by then. He'd lost track exactly, his watch face blurring every time he checked it. And the dark out here wasn't the kind that ever really adjusted to. Even after hours in it, his eyes still weren't finding much beyond the first few rows of trunks. Then ahead of him, something resolved out of the dark that wasn't a tree. It took him a second to be sure. A shape, upright, roughly 60 yards out. A figure, most probably a woman, older from the way she carried herself, dressed plainly, her back fully turned. She wasn't standing still. She was walking, steady and unhurried, moving across ground that had nearly taken Carter's ankle out twice that same day, picking her way over roots and broken lava without once looking down. He didn't move at first. Some part of him, the part that had spent 3 days alone listening to a forest that kept producing footsteps with no one attached to them, wanted very badly for this to just be another hiker, a patrol volunteer, anyone. "Hey!" he shouted, and the word came out wrecked, barely more than a rasp. She didn't turn. She didn't slow down either, but she didn't seem to speed up. She simply stayed exactly the distance she'd started at, no matter how much ground Carter tried to close. He pushed forward anyway, half walking, half stumbling, watching her outline drift between the trunks ahead of him, always just on the edge of what his flashlight beam could hold steady. He followed her for what felt like a long time. Long enough that the black sky over the canopy had started, almost without him noticing, to soften into the dull gray of early morning. And somewhere in that stretch of half light, between one tree and the next, she simply wasn't there anymore. No sound of her leaving, no sign of where she'd gone. Just an empty stretch of forest where a person had been a few seconds before. Carter would say later that he couldn't be sure what he'd actually seen by that point. 3 nights with almost no sleep, no food, barely any water, do strange things to what a person's eyes report back. He's never claimed certainty. What he has said, every time he's been asked, is that he saw someone. Not a shadow, not a trick of the fog. Someone walking with intent, somewhere a person had no reason to be at 4 in the morning. What he found instead, pushing forward into the gray light where she'd disappeared, was a break in the trees ahead of him, and beyond it, the pale stretch of the rescue access road. Carter ran for it without looking back, broke out of the tree line, and went down hard on the gravel, rolling over his own pack and shattering the camera against the stones. He stayed there a while on his back, staring up at a sky he hadn't seen properly in 3 days. The search helicopter found him not long after sunrise and got him to hospital within the hour. The hospital report listed severe dehydration, sleep deprivation, and acute psychological trauma. Consistent, doctors noted, with anyone who'd spent 3 days lost in dense, disorienting terrain without food or reliable water. What stood out to the medical staff was smaller than that. Carter was certain he'd only been in the forest one night. His rental car had been parked at the trailhead for 72 hours. He never uploaded the footage from that trip. There's one surviving frame, the last thing his camera caught before it shattered on the gravel. A wide shot of the tree line, gray morning light, nothing moving in it. He still looks at it sometimes. Near the left edge, where 2 large roots arch low over the path, he says the shadow sits wrong, not wrong enough to point to, wrong enough that he doesn't show it to people anymore. Ethan Carter walked out alive. Every year, dozens of people who walk the same paths don't.